Hello and welcome back. In this video I'm going to be showing you how to do a ladder stitch, sometimes called a slip stitch or a blind stitch. A ladder stitch or an invisible stitch. A ladder stitch or invisible stitch, or sometimes known as a slip stitch, is used for sewing up openings. Possibly on a cuddly toy you've made, you might want to close up the opening after you've stuffed it. On a cushion cover, if you're not going to use a zip and you want to sew the cushion cover shut. And also, if you rip a seam and it needs mending, you would need to use a ladder stitch or invisible stitch. For the purpose of this demonstration, I've made a small pillow with a 1 centimetre seam allowance. I've threaded my needle with a dark, I think it's a navy blue cotton, and I'm going to tie a knot in it. It's double thread for this exercise. If you were doing a more delicate project, you'd probably do single thread, but in this case I'm using double thread with a double knot in it. For the first stitch, I'm going to take my needle inside the seam allowance and come up directly on the fold line for my first stitch. Then we're going to go down through the fabric on the opposite side on the fold of the seam allowance in a parallel line, about 1/8 of an inch or 0.3 of a centimetre. Then we're going to go back down through the seam allowance on the fold directly opposite where we've just come out with the last stitch, and again do about 1/8 of an inch stitch in a parallel line, and then go to the opposite side again, directly opposite where we came out, and do another 1/8 of an inch, 0.3 of a centimetre stitch. Now we should have formed 3 stitches. We now have 3 rungs on our ladder. We're going to continue with these stitches all the way to the end now, keeping in a nice parallel line with the seam on the fold, taking 1/8 of an inch stitch on each side. So it's 1/8 of an inch stitch on one side, crossing over. The crossover is where you make the rung of the ladder, crossing over to the other side, taking another 1/8 of an inch, crossing over, another 1/8 of an inch, and eventually you'll get lots of rungs on your ladder and you'll be able to pull your stitches tight, and this is where they become invisible, and this is how it gets its other name as an invisible stitch. So continue to the end of your seam doing your ladder stitch, going from side to side. I'm saying I'm doing 1/8 of an inch. My stitch length is 1/8 of an inch, but you can do whatever length you like. I wouldn't go too much bigger than 1/8 of an inch, maybe 1/4 of an inch, but depends on what sort of thing you're mending really, or you're sewing up. You'll notice here that I'm doing the stitch slightly different. What I'm doing is opening up the seam allowance so I can see the fold a lot easier. I actually find it easier to do it this way, but the choice is yours, and you can't do it like this when you get really close to the end of the seam, especially if it's a closed seam like this one. So after this little bit, I'm going to go back to the original way of sewing. I'm almost at the end of the seam now, so I'm going to do my last couple of stitches, and then I'm going to pull my stitches tight so they become invisible, and I'm going to try and do a little knot just on the inside of the seam. In fact, I'm going to do 2 knots just on the inside of the seam, so hopefully they'll be hidden inside the seam allowance and nobody's going to see them. Then I'm going to put my needle through the fabric and come out at the side, clip. So there's our invisible seam, all finished. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed the video. If you have enjoyed it, could you please like and subscribe? Thank you once again.